My family has owned this 20-acre farm for 3 generations. It is not some massive agricultural operation, just a modest homestead with a small orchard, a few acres of hayfields, and a special area where I keep my rescue boars. Yes, boars. Not many people rescue these magnificent creatures, but someone has to. Most folks do not understand them. They see their size, their tusks, and assume they are nothing but dangerous wild animals. But I know better. Each of my 5 boars has a name, a personality, and a story of survival. They were all rescued from abusive situations or illegal game farms where they were mistreated. Under my care, they have become almost like pets, gentle with those they trust, but still undeniably powerful animals that command respect. I have never been one for confrontation. I keep to myself, tend to my land, care for my animals, and mind my own business. That was always enough for me. The neighboring properties used to be owned by like-minded folks, other small farmers or people who simply wanted space away from the crowded suburbs. We had an unspoken agreement: respect each other's boundaries and privacy. That all changed 3 years ago when Whispering Pines Luxury Estates began construction less than a mile from my property line. I did not think much of it at first. People need places to live, and that land had been for sale for years. But what I did not anticipate was the type of people who would move in, or more specifically, the woman who would become the president of their homeowners association. Corinne Harrington. Even her name seems to carry an air of entitlement when I say it now. The first time I encountered her was at the local farmer's market where I occasionally sell honey from my beehives. She approached my stand with that plastic smile that never quite reaches the eyes. "So you are the one with that?" She paused, her nose wrinkling slightly. "Farm next to our development. Have you ever considered selling? That land would make a beautiful community park for our residents." I politely explained that my family had worked that land for generations, and I had no interest in selling. Her smile tightened as she replied, "Well, perhaps you could at least clean it up a bit. Some of our homeowners have complained about the eyesore. Property values, you understand." That was just the beginning. Over the following months, I would occasionally see her in town, and she always had some backhanded comment about my little animal sanctuary or questions about whether my operation was properly zoned and permitted. I always remained civil, even as my internal frustration grew. I have all my permits in order. My animals are well cared for. My property, while not manicured like a golf course, is maintained with respect for the natural landscape. Then came the morning I spotted the survey stakes. They formed a straight line about 20 feet inside what I knew to be my property boundary. I had been out checking my fence line, a regular task when you keep animals, when I noticed them. Bright orange plastic markers driven into my soil. Next to them were boot prints that did not belong to me. Someone had been measuring my land without my knowledge or permission. I pulled out one of the stakes and examined it. It bore the logo of Precision Property Surveyors, a company I had never contacted. The next day, I caught them in the act. 3 men in polo shirts with clipboards walking across my hayfield, placing more stakes. I approached them calmly but firmly, my boots crunching on the dry summer grass to announce my presence. "Excuse me," I called out as I got closer. "This is private property. May I ask what you are doing here?" The oldest of the 3, a gray-haired man with sunglasses hanging from a cord around his neck, stepped forward with an extended hand. "Good morning. We are just marking out the area for the upcoming community event. Nothing to worry about." I did not shake his hand. "What community event? This is my land." The 3 men exchanged glances before the spokesperson continued. "There must be some confusion. We were hired by the Whispering Pines HOA to prepare for their annual summer festival. According to their documentation, this section falls under community use through an easement agreement." My stomach tightened. No such agreement existed. "I am afraid there is indeed confusion, but not on my part. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and there is no easement that would allow for what you are describing. I would appreciate it if you left immediately." Instead of apologizing or leaving, the man reached into his folder and pulled out what appeared to be some sort of document. "Ms. Harrington provided this paperwork indicating the HOA's right to use this space. Perhaps you should take it up with her directly. We are just doing our job." I took the paper from him and scanned it quickly. It was full of legal jargon and references to county plot numbers that looked official but meant nothing to me. What was clear, however, was that someone was trying to claim rights to my property without my knowledge or consent. I handed the paper back. This document does not change the fact that you are currently trespassing. Please leave now, or I will be forced to call the sheriff. They finally packed up their equipment, but not without murmuring among themselves about difficult landowners and just following instructions. As they retreated toward the Whispering Pines development, my mind was already racing. I needed to understand what was happening and stop it before things escalated further. But I had no idea just how far Karen was willing to go. I did not have to wait long for a confrontation. The very next morning, as I was feeding the boars their breakfast, I heard the distinctive sound of tires on gravel. A sleek white SUV with Whispering Pines HOA emblazoned on the door pulled up my driveway. Karen stepped out, dressed as if she were heading to a corporate board meeting rather than a rural farm visit. Designer sunglasses, immaculate blonde bob, crisp blazer, and high heels that were clearly impractical for walking on unpaved surfaces. "Good morning," she called out with false cheerfulness as she picked her way carefully toward me. "I understand there was some confusion yesterday with the survey team." I wiped my hands on my work jeans and stood my ground. There was no confusion. They were trespassing on my property. Karen's smile did not falter as she reached into her leather portfolio. "I have documentation showing that a portion of your property falls under a community access easement established in 1972. It was never formally removed when the original Stone Creek development was abandoned." She handed me a stack of papers that looked impressively official. I am no lawyer, but even I could see this was an attempt to resurrect a decades-old failed development plan that had never been completed. The original Stone Creek project had indeed been planned in the 70s, but was abandoned after the developer went bankrupt. My grandfather had purchased additional acreage from that bankruptcy sale, with all easements explicitly terminated. "These documents are irrelevant," I stated, handing them back without fully examining all the pages. "Any easements were formally terminated when my grandfather purchased the additional acreage in 1978. I have the deed and title documents to prove it." Karen's smile tightened fractionally. "Well, our legal team sees it differently, and unfortunately, we have already sent out invitations to our 500 residents for our annual summer festival to be held on what we are calling Whispering Meadows. The event is in 3 weeks." I felt my face flush with anger. "You sent out invitations to trespass on my land." She laughed lightly as if I had said something mildly amusing at a cocktail party. "It is not trespassing if we have legal right to access, and we do. Our lawyers have reviewed everything thoroughly." She looked around at my property with thinly veiled disdain. "Besides, we are actually doing you a favor. That field is just sitting there unused. We will bring in professional landscapers to make it presentable for the event. You should be thanking us for the free upgrade." "I grow hay in that field," I said through gritted teeth. "And I expect you to send out retractions immediately informing your residents that the event will need to be relocated." Karen's pleasant facade dropped for just a moment, revealing the steel beneath. "That will not be happening. The invitations have been sent, deposits have been paid to vendors, and the event is proceeding as planned. If you try to interfere, we have the legal resources to make things very difficult for you." She glanced meaningfully toward my boar enclosure. "Including a review of your permits for keeping those animals. Are you certain everything is up to code?" With that thinly veiled threat hanging in the air, she turned and walked back to her SUV, calling over her shoulder, "Our landscaping team will be here next week to begin preparations. I suggest you cooperate. It will be easier for everyone that way." As her vehicle disappeared down my driveway in a cloud of dust, I stood frozen with a mixture of shock and rage. Not only was she planning to steal my land for her event, but she was also threatening me and my animals. I needed help, and I needed it fast. I spent the rest of that day on the phone, first with the county records office to confirm what I already knew, that my property boundaries were exactly as I understood them, with no active easements. Then I called a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. The conversation was not encouraging. Based on what you have told me, the attorney said, they do not have a legal right to use your land, but getting an emergency injunction could be complicated and time-consuming. Courts move slowly, and with only 3 weeks until their event, we might not get a hearing in time. So they can just take my land? I asked incredulously. No, no, the lawyer assured me. But stopping them before their event might be challenging. However, if they do trespass, you will have a very strong case for damages afterward. That was not the answer I wanted. I did not want damages after the fact. I wanted to prevent 500 strangers from trampling my hayfield and disturbing my animals. I needed a more immediate solution. The next day, I gathered all my property documentation, the original deeds, the additional purchase my grandfather had made, tax records showing decades of property tax payments on the full acreage, and recent survey maps clearly showing my boundaries. Armed with this evidence, I decided to attend the next Whispering Pines HOA meeting. Perhaps if the other homeowners understood what their president was doing, they would put a stop to it. I arrived at their clubhouse 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. The building was impressive, all stone and glass with manicured gardens surrounding it. Inside, residents were gathering in a large meeting room with rows of chairs facing a raised platform where the HOA board would sit. I felt immediately out of place in my clean but simple clothes among people dressed in business casual attire, but I was determined to be heard. When Karen spotted me taking a seat in the back row, I saw momentary surprise cross her face before she composed herself and approached me. "This is a private meeting for Whispering Pines residents," she said quietly but firmly. "I am afraid I will have to ask you to leave." "I understand this is a private meeting," I replied, keeping my voice calm and even. "But as the matter of my property is on the agenda for discussion, I believe I have a right to be present." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Very well, but non-residents are only permitted to speak during the designated public comment period, and only for 3 minutes." I nodded my agreement, and she walked away to confer with the other board members, occasionally glancing back at me with obvious displeasure. The meeting began with standard HOA business, approving previous minutes, discussing landscaping contracts, and addressing violations of community standards. Then Karen moved to the topic I was waiting for, the summer festival. "As you all know from your invitations," she announced with a broad smile, "our annual summer festival will be held at the beautiful Whispering Meadows this year. We have secured access to this picturesque space adjacent to our community, and the event planning committee has arranged for food vendors, a live band, activities for children, and a spectacular fireworks display to cap off the evening." The residents applauded enthusiastically. Karen continued, "We have already begun preliminary site preparation, and next week our landscaping team will begin transforming the space into a venue worthy of our community." When she finally opened the floor for public comments, I stood and walked to the microphone set up in the center aisle. I could feel the curious eyes of the residents on me, the outsider, the farmer, the anomaly in their carefully curated world. "Good evening," I began. "My name is Alexander Morgan. I own the farm adjacent to your development, including the land you are calling Whispering Meadows. I am here to inform you that your HOA has not secured access to my property. There is no legal easement or agreement in place. The documentation your board has relied upon references abandoned development plans from the 1970s that have no legal standing today." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as I held up my folder of documents. "I have here the complete legal history of the property, including the termination of all previous easements when my grandfather purchased the additional acreage in 1978. I have attempted to communicate this to Ms. Harrington, but she has dismissed my concerns and proceeded with planning an event on my private property without permission." Karen quickly stepped to her microphone. "Mr. Morgan is mistaken about the legal status of the property in question. Our attorneys have thoroughly reviewed all relevant documents and confirmed our right to access this space for community events." "Then your attorneys are wrong," I replied flatly. "And I am formally notifying you and all residents present that anyone entering my property for this planned festival will be trespassing. I do not wish to create conflict with my neighbors, but I will defend my property rights." Corinne's professional veneer cracked slightly as she responded, her voice taking on a sharper edge. Mr. Morgan seems to forget that Whispering Pines represents over 500 homeowners and substantial resources. Perhaps instead of making threats, he should consider that cooperating with progress might be in his best interest. One of the other board members leaned over to whisper something to Corinne, who nodded before addressing the crowd again. In the interest of time, we need to move on with our agenda. The Festival Planning Committee will continue their work, and our legal team will address any legitimate concerns about access. Now, moving on to our next agenda item. Just like that, I was dismissed. As I returned to my seat, I caught snippets of conversation around me. Some residents looked concerned, but others were openly dismissive. Probably just wants money. Those old farms are eyesores anyway. Can you imagine still living like that when you could sell to a developer? I stayed for the remainder of the meeting, though no one spoke to me directly. As people filed out afterward, I noticed a few curious glances my way, but most avoided eye contact. I had become the enemy, the obstacle to their perfect summer festival. When I returned home that evening, I felt defeated but not broken. If legal channels would not work quickly enough and direct communication had failed, I needed another approach. As I walked out to check on my boars before turning in for the night, an idea began to form. My 5 boars, Magnus, Brutus, Thor, Odin, and Rufus, approached the fence as I drew near. They knew my footsteps and associated my presence with food and care. Each weighed between 200 and 300 pounds, with impressive tusks and a powerful build that would intimidate anyone unfamiliar with them. But to me, they were gentle giants, each rescued from terrible circumstances and rehabilitated with patience and care. Magnus, the largest and oldest, came from an illegal hunting operation where he had been kept in a pen barely large enough for him to turn around. Brutus and Thor were brothers, rescued as piglets from a hoarder who had collected exotic animals without the means to care for them properly. Odin had been confiscated from a backyard butcher operation, and little Rufus, who was not so little at 220 pounds, had been found wandering along a highway, likely escaped or abandoned from an amateur farmer who did not realize what they were getting into. Under my care, they had thrived in their spacious, natural habitat. They had never shown aggression toward me or the few visitors I trusted enough to introduce them to. But to strangers, they remained imposing, intimidating creatures that commanded immediate respect and caution. As I watched them root around their enclosure in the fatting evening light, a plan began to take shape in my mind. I would not let Corinne and her HOA take my land without a fight. But I would need to be smart about it, strategic, careful, and absolutely within the bounds of the law. I had 3 weeks to prepare, and I intended to use every day to my advantage. The next morning, I drove to the county records office to obtain official copies of all my property documents. The clerk, an older woman named Mabel who had worked there for decades, recognized me immediately. "Alex Morgan, I have not seen you in here since you took over your father's place. What can I help you with today?" I explained the situation, and her friendly expression gradually turned serious. "Those Whispering Pines people have been in here too, you know," she confided, lowering her voice though we were alone in the records room. "That woman, Harrington, I think, has had their lawyers requesting all sorts of historical documents about the old Stone Creek development." This confirmed my suspicions that Corinne was actively trying to find some legal loophole to claim rights to my land. With Mabel's help, I pulled together a comprehensive file documenting my clear ownership, including the explicit termination of all previous easements. "You might want to speak with Sheriff Donovan too," Mabel suggested as she certified the copies for me. "Get ahead of this. If they do trespass, you will want law enforcement aware of the situation beforehand." It was excellent advice. My next stop was the sheriff's office, where I spoke with Deputy Collins, as Sheriff Donovan was out on a call. The deputy listened carefully to my concerns and reviewed my documentation. "Legally speaking, if they come onto your property without permission, it is trespassing," he confirmed. "But," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "these situations can get complicated. The Whispering Pines HOA has significant influence in the county these days. Their development brings in substantial tax revenue. Are you saying the sheriff's department would not enforce trespassing laws against them? I asked incredulously. No, not at all, Deputy Collins assured me quickly. I am just suggesting that you might want to consider all options. Sometimes a compromise can avoid a lot of headaches. I left the sheriff's office feeling unsettled. It seemed that even law enforcement was hesitant to directly challenge the powerful HOA. I would need to strengthen my position further. For the next few days, I reached out to neighboring farmers and longtime residents who had witnessed previous conflicts with the expanding suburban developments. The stories I heard were troubling property line disputes, complaints about agricultural smells and sounds, pressure to sell land to developers. But I also received valuable advice about documenting everything and knowing my rights. Old Bill Jenkins, whose dairy farm had been operating for over 50 years, put it bluntly. These city folks move out here for the country feel, but then want to change everything that makes it country. Stand your ground, boy. Once you give them an inch, they will take your whole farm. Armed with advice and documentation, I consulted with a surveyor to officially mark my property lines with permanent metal stakes and bright marking tape. I installed no trespassing and private property signs at regular intervals along the boundaries adjacent to the Whispering Pines development. I also set up trail cameras in trees overlooking the area where they planned to hold their festival. If they trespassed, I would have evidence. Throughout this process, I continued my daily work caring for my animals and maintaining my farm. The Boars sensed my anxiety and became more vigilant when I was near their enclosure, watching me with their intelligent eyes as if trying to understand the source of my concern. Their enclosure was substantial, nearly 2 acres of fenced terrain that included a muddy wallow they loved, shady trees, and plenty of space to root and forage. The fence was sturdy, designed to keep them in and predators out. But with some modifications, I realized it could serve another purpose in my developing plan. I spent the next few days designing and constructing an extension to their enclosure, a section with a secure gate that could be opened to allow them access to the hayfield if needed, while still keeping them contained within a perimeter. It was hard work, but with each post I set into the ground, each section of heavy-gauge fencing I secured, my determination grew stronger. As the date of the festival drew closer, Coren's team moved from surveying to active preparations despite my explicit objections. A week before the event, I returned from a supply run to town to find landscaping equipment on my property, workers with weed trimmers clearing areas of the natural grasses in my hayfield, marking out spaces for tents and stages. I parked my truck and approached the crew's supervisor, a young man with a clipboard who looked distinctly uncomfortable as I walked up. "Excuse me, but this is private property. You and your team need to leave immediately." The supervisor glanced down at his clipboard, then back at me. "Are you Mr. Morgan? We were told this area has been approved for the Whispering Pines Summer Festival. We are just doing preliminary site preparation." "Whoever told you that was mistaken," I replied firmly. "I am the legal owner of this property and no approval has been given. Please gather your crew and equipment and leave now." The supervisor hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "Let me call Ms. Harrington to straighten this out." I waited as he stepped away to make the call, watching the workers continue their destruction of my hayfield. After a brief conversation, the supervisor returned looking even more uncomfortable. "Ms. Harrington says the work is to proceed as planned. She says there is legal documentation supporting their use of this land, and if you continue to interfere, their attorneys will contact you directly." The audacity was breathtaking. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office, requesting assistance with trespassers on my property. When I explained the situation, I was told a deputy would be dispatched when available, but it might be some time due to other calls. While waiting, I approached each worker individually, informing them they were trespassing on private property and could potentially be liable alongside their employer. Some looked concerned, others indifferent, but none stopped working. They had their orders. When Deputy Rodriguez finally arrived nearly 2 hours later, most of the damage to my field had already been done. Areas had been cleared, markings placed for tents and vendor booths, and the workers were packing up for the day anyway. The deputy reviewed my documentation and spoke with the few remaining workers, confirming that they were acting under the direction of the Whispering Pines HOA. He took notes and photographs for his report. "Technically, this is a civil matter," he explained apologetically. "I can document the trespassing, but enforcement would likely require a court order." "So they can just take my land and there is nothing I can do about it?" I asked, frustration evident in my voice. "I did not say that," Deputy Rodriguez replied carefully. "You have the right to protect your property from trespassers. Just be careful about how you do it. No confrontations that could escalate to violence." After the deputy left, I walked the perimeter of my property, documenting the damage with photographs and video. The cleared areas, the equipment tracks, the stakes marking out what appeared to be a stage area and rows of vendor booths. They had even marked a space for portable toilets near my property line with the development. That evening, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing the Whispering Pines HOA. It cited obscure county regulations and historical documents to claim limited use rights to what they were now officially calling Whispering Meadows Community Space. The letter warned against any interference with community activities and suggested that doing so could result in legal action against me. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, who called me the next morning. "They are building their case on very shaky legal ground," he assured me. "But they are clearly hoping to establish a precedent through use. If they hold this event and you do not actively prevent it, they could later claim established use rights." "So what do I do?" I asked. "Document everything. Continue to assert your ownership clearly and firmly. Post additional signage. And if they proceed with the event, be present to formally inform participants they are trespassing." It was not the aggressive response I had hoped for, but I understood the legal realities. A direct confrontation could potentially backfire, especially given the HOA's resources and influence. I needed to be smarter than that. The day before the festival, a convoy of rental trucks arrived, bringing tents, tables, chairs, stage equipment, and other supplies. I approached with my documentation in hand and a calm but firm demeanor. The delivery workers were just doing their jobs, but I made sure each of them understood they were placing equipment on private property without permission. "We just deliver where we are told, man," one worker shrugged. "Take it up with whoever placed the order." And so I did. I drove directly to Corinne's house, a sprawling colonial-style home with perfectly manicured landscaping at the entrance to the Whispering Pines development. Her surprise at seeing me on her doorstep was evident, but she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Morgan, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" I handed her a formally prepared notice, stating clearly that the planned festival was to take place on my private property without permission, and that proceeding would constitute willful trespassing. "This is your final warning," I said as she reluctantly took the paper. "Cancel the event or relocate it to property you actually have the right to use." Corinne glanced at the notice before letting out a small, condescending laugh. "Or what? Will you call the sheriff again? File another complaint that will take months to work through the system?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "By then, our event will be long over, and we will have established precedent for the community's use of that space." "You are making a mistake," I warned. "No, Mr. Morgan, you are the one making a mistake. You are standing in the way of progress, of community development. That sad little farm of yours is a relic of the past. Sooner or later, you will sell, just like every other holdout eventually does. We are simply accelerating the inevitable." Her arrogance fueled my resolve. "Tomorrow will not go the way you expect," I said simply, turning to leave. "Is that a threat?" she called after me. "Because our security team will be present, and they will not hesitate to remove anyone who disrupts our community event." I did not respond. There was nothing more to say. The lines had been drawn, and tomorrow would bring the confrontation that had been building for weeks. That night, I made my final preparations. I checked and double-checked the new section of fencing and the gate mechanisms that would allow my boars access to the field if needed. I loaded a bullhorn with fresh batteries. I charged my phone and camera to document everything. And I called Sheriff Donovan at his home number, a liberty I took only because of our long-standing acquaintance through community events. "I need your help tomorrow," I explained, detailing the situation and my concerns. "I do not want this to escalate, but I need law enforcement present to acknowledge my property rights." There was a long pause before he responded. "Alex, you know these situations are delicate. The county commissioners have made it clear they want good relations with Whispering Pines." "I am not asking you to take sides," I clarified. "I am asking you to be present to keep the peace and acknowledge the legal reality of my property boundaries. That is all." Another pause. "All right, I cannot promise anything, but I will try to be in the area tomorrow. Just do not do anything rash, Alex." "I would not dream of it," I replied, a plan already solidifying in my mind. The morning of the festival dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for an outdoor event. From my kitchen window, I could see vehicles arriving early, caterers, event staff, sound system technicians, all trespassing on my land as if they had every right to be there. I watched as they set up tents, arranged tables and chairs, positioned a stage complete with speakers and lighting. Karen was there too, directing activities with the precision of a military commander. I waited. Timing would be crucial. I wanted the maximum impact with the minimum risk to people or animals. My boars were secure in their regular enclosure but visibly restless, sensing my tension and the unusual activity nearby. By early afternoon, guests began to arrive, first a trickle, then a steady stream of Whispering Pines residents in summer attire, carrying lawn chairs and coolers, children running ahead with excited energy. I estimated at least 300 people had gathered by the time Karen took the stage to officially welcome everyone to the first annual Whispering Meadows Summer Festival. That was my cue. I approached from my property, bullhorn in hand, Sheriff Donovan reluctantly walking beside me after I had called him to report the mass trespassing in progress. As I neared the crowd, I raised the bullhorn. "Attention, everyone," my voice boomed across the field. "My name is Alexander Morgan. I am the legal owner of this property. You are all currently trespassing on private land. I ask that you please pack up your belongings and leave immediately." The music stopped abruptly. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd as people turned to see who was speaking. Karen recovered quickly, grabbing a microphone from the stage. "Everyone, please remain calm and enjoy the festival. This is a misunderstanding that our legal team is addressing. Mr. Morgan is confused about property boundaries." I stepped closer, Sheriff Donovan still at my side, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "There is no confusion about the boundaries. Sheriff, could you please confirm for these people that this land is legally my property according to county records?" All eyes turned to Sheriff Donovan, who cleared his throat awkwardly before speaking. "The county records do indicate that this parcel is registered to the Morgan family, yes." "See, he is just confirming what I already told everyone," I announced through the bullhorn. "You have all been misled by your HOA. This is private property and you are trespassing." Karen's face had flushed red with anger and embarrassment, but she maintained her composure as she addressed the crowd again. "The sheriff also knows that there are historical easements and access rights that the Morgan family chooses to ignore. Our attorneys have thoroughly reviewed the situation. Please, everyone, return to enjoying the festival while this minor distraction is addressed." To my dismay, most of the crowd seemed reassured by her words, turning back to their activities and conversations. Karen approached me directly, speaking low enough that only I and the sheriff could hear. "You are making a fool of yourself, Morgan. Even if you are technically correct about the property line, do you really think you can force hundreds of people to leave? What are you going to do, have the sheriff arrest everyone? He would not dare." She was right, and she knew it. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably beside me, clearly unwilling to create a scene by removing hundreds of residents from what they believed was a legitimate community event. Karen smiled triumphantly before turning back toward the stage. "This is not over," I called after her. "Oh, I think it is," she replied without looking back. "Enjoy watching our community put your unused field to proper use." I retreated toward my house, pulling out my phone as I walked. It was time for Plan B. I made a quick call to my neighbor, Jim Peterson, who had agreed to help if needed. "It is time," I said simply. "Are you in position?" "Ready and waiting," Jim confirmed. He was parked on the access road with his truck and horse trailer, prepared to carry out the next phase of our plan. I returned to the boar enclosure, where my 5 magnificent animals waited. They could sense something important was happening. I opened the interior gate that would allow them access to the extended enclosure section I had prepared, the section that encompassed a portion of the festival grounds within its secure perimeter. "Ready for some exercise, boys?" I asked as I guided them through with buckets of their favorite treats. They moved eagerly into the new space, excited to explore the extended territory. I closed the interior gate behind them, ensuring they could not return to their regular enclosure. Now they were contained within the extended section, which included roughly a quarter of the area where festival attendees were gathered. I made my way to the final gate, the one that would allow the boars access to the festival grounds, still safely contained within the extended perimeter fencing. Before opening it, I positioned myself at the edge of the crowd with my bullhorn. "Final warning," I announced. "This is private property. For your safety, I must insist that you leave immediately. My rescue boars are about to be released into their new exercise area, which includes this section of my property." This got people's attention. Concerned murmurs spread through the crowd. Karen rushed toward me, her face contorted with anger. "What the hell do you think you are doing? There are children here." "I am simply allowing my animals access to their legitimate exercise area on my property," I replied calmly. "If there are trespassers present, that is hardly my fault. I have given ample warning." "You would not dare," she hissed. I met her gaze steadily. "Try me." She turned to the sheriff. "Stop him. This is reckless endangerment." Sheriff Donovan looked genuinely torn. "Alex, I cannot let you release large animals into an area with people present. That would create a public safety issue." "I understand your concern, Sheriff," I replied. "But these animals are contained within a secure perimeter on my private property. If people choose to remain inside that perimeter after being warned, they are accepting the risk." While this confrontation was unfolding, Jim had quietly opened the final gate. Right on cue, my 5 massive boars came trotting into view, curious about the new space and the unusual commotion. They were not charging or behaving aggressively, just exploring. But the effect on the crowd was instantaneous. Someone screamed, then another. Suddenly people were grabbing their belongings and children, abandoning food and drinks as they fled toward the exit. The boars, startled by the commotion, began moving more quickly, which only increased the panic. From my position, I could see the entire scene unfold, hundreds of festival goers scrambling to escape, pushing and shoving to get through the single entry point the HOA had established.